The snow fell softly on the grand estate of Springwood as the morning of January 30th, 1882, began. Inside the warm mansion overlooking the Hudson River, Sarah Delano Roosevelt held her newborn son close to her chest. The baby boy had bright eyes and strong lungs that filled the room with his cries. James Roosevelt, the proud father, looked down at his first child with Sarah and smiled. They would name him Franklin Delano Roosevelt, after Sarah's beloved uncle Franklin Delano. The Roosevelt family was one of the wealthiest in New York. His father would tell him stories about the old days when the Hudson River was full of sailing ships carrying goods to New York City. He explained how their family had come to America from Holland many generations ago and worked hard to build their fortune. Most importantly, James taught Franklin that being rich meant you should help people who had less than you did. They owned vast lands along the Hudson River, where their beautiful home sat like a castle among the trees. She was a stern but kind woman from Germany who spoke several languages. Franklin loved these months more than any other time of the year. Many of the local fishing families lost their boats and equipment. Franklin watched his parents organize relief efforts to help these families get back on their feet. Sarah Roosevelt spent days cooking meals for families who had lost their homes. James Roosevelt used his own money to help the fishermen buy new boats and nets. He had been born into wealth and privilege, but his parents had taught him to use these advantages to serve others. His early years at Hyde Park had given him a strong foundation of values that would guide him through the great challenges that lay ahead in his future. The island was wild and beautiful, with thick forests and rocky shores where the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the cliffs. He saw how grateful the island people were for his family's help. But he also noticed that his parents never acted like they deserved special thanks for what they did. They simply saw helping others as the right thing to do. Here Franklin learned to sail small boats and swim in the cold ocean water. He learned that real strength came from helping people who were weaker or less fortunate. He saw that money and privilege were not meant to separate you from other people, but to give you the power to make their lives better. He became an expert at identifying the different types of fish and seabirds that lived around the island. Every morning, after breakfast, Franklin would sit in the library with Miss Reinhardt to learn his letters and numbers. She taught him to read using books about history and geography. By the time he was 7, Franklin could speak basic French and German, along with English. His nursery was filled with expensive toys brought from Europe. They visited England, France, and Germany, where Franklin saw great museums and historical sites. But what impressed him most were the conversations he had with people from different countries. He discovered that despite speaking different languages and having different customs, people everywhere had similar hopes and fears. They all wanted their children to be healthy and happy. They all wanted to live in peace and have enough food to eat. Unlike most children who only wanted to hear their own voices, Franklin loved to listen to what other people had to say. When the servants in the house had problems, he would sit quietly and pay attention to their concerns. If two playmates had an argument, Franklin would hear both sides before suggesting a solution that made everyone happy. He had his own pony to ride around the estate grounds. The local farmers were struggling to bring in their hay before a big storm arrived. Most wealthy children would never think to get their hands dirty helping working people. But Franklin seemed to understand naturally that his comfortable life meant he should help others when they needed it. This was not something his parents had to force him to do. It came from his own heart. Franklin saw the worried looks on their faces when his father spoke with them during their morning walk. Without being asked, Franklin ran back to the house and gathered all the neighbor children he could find. He convinced them to spend the afternoon helping the farmers load hay onto their wagons. The family employed many servants who attended to his every need. There was a cook to prepare his meals, a gardener to tend the flowers he loved to pick, and several maids to keep his clothes clean and pressed. James Roosevelt made his fortune in coal and railroads, while Sarah came from the rich Delano family, who had made their money in the China trade. Little Franklin would never know what it meant to worry about money or wonder where his next meal would come from. Every morning when the weather was good, he would take Franklin on long walks around their estate. They would visit the tenant farmers who worked their land and check on the animals in the barns. James taught Franklin the names of all the trees and flowers that grew on their property. He showed him how to identify different birds by their songs, and how to tell which way the wind was blowing by watching the leaves. From his earliest days, Franklin lived a life that most children could only dream about. But Sarah Roosevelt was not content to simply spoil her precious son. She believed that wealthy families had a duty to raise children who would serve others and make the world better. From the time Franklin could walk and talk, she taught him that his privileges came with responsibilities. When he was old enough to understand, she would tell him stories about his ancestors, who had fought in the American Revolution and helped build the new nation. James Roosevelt was a gentle father who loved to spend time with his son. These walks became some of Franklin's happiest memories. When Franklin turned 5, his parents hired a governess named Miss Reinhardt to begin his education. Miss Reinhardt noticed something special about young Franklin that would stay with him for the rest of his life. One summer day when Franklin was 8 years old, something happened that showed his true character. When Sarah Roosevelt discovered what her son had done, she was both proud and surprised. the Roosevelt family spent every summer at their cottage on Campobello Island in Canada. During one memorable summer, when Franklin was 9, a terrible storm hit Campobello Island. Franklin insisted on helping with the relief work. He carried food to hungry families and helped repair damaged houses. These experiences on Campobello Island taught Franklin important lessons about leadership and service. As Franklin grew older, his parents began to take him on trips to Europe. By the time Franklin reached his 10th birthday, it was clear that he was no ordinary child. The golden boy of Hyde Park was ready to step into the wider world and begin the journey that would one day make him one of the most important leaders in American history. The train whistle blew loudly as 14-year-old Franklin Roosevelt stepped onto the platform at Groton School in Massachusetts. His mother, Sarah, had tears in her eyes as she watched her beloved son prepare to leave home for the first time. The headmaster, Endicott Peabody, was a tall and serious man who believed that wealthy boys needed strict discipline to become good men. The school was cold in winter, and the rules were harsh. Students had to wake up at 6 in the morning for cold showers. They ate simple meals and slept in small rooms with thin blankets. He had known Franklin's father and understood the values that Sarah and James had taught their son. Peabody took Franklin under his wing and began teaching him lessons that would shape his entire life. The most important lesson was that God had given wealthy people their advantages, so they could serve those who had less. He joined the debate team where he learned to speak clearly and persuade others with his words. He played football, even though he was not very strong or fast. Most importantly, he started organizing activities to help poor families in the nearby town. Franklin convinced his classmates to collect money and clothes for families who did not have enough to eat or stay warm in winter. Franklin quickly learned that his family's money meant nothing within these walls. Other boys began to respect him, not because of his family's wealth, but because of his genuine desire to help people. He had a special talent for bringing different groups together and finding solutions that everyone could accept. His distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had become President of the United States after William McKinley was shot and killed. He applied to become a writer for the Harvard Crimson, the college newspaper. Many students wanted these positions because working for the Crimson was considered very important. Franklin had to compete against students who had more experience and better writing skills. But he worked harder than anyone else and eventually earned a spot on the newspaper staff. Suddenly, the Roosevelt name was famous across the country. Franklin felt proud of his family connection to the president, but also understood that this brought new responsibilities. People would expect great things from anyone related to Theodore Roosevelt. He learned to ask good questions and find interesting stories. He discovered how to write clearly so that ordinary people could understand complicated subjects. Many families lived in crowded apartments without enough heat or clean water. Children worked in factories instead of going to school. Franklin started writing articles for the Crimson about these problems and suggesting ways the government could help solve them. Most importantly, he learned how to investigate problems and propose solutions that would actually work. She never talked about her charitable work to impress people or make herself look good. She simply saw human suffering and felt called to do something about it. Franklin realized that Eleanor understood the Christian duty that Headmaster Peabody had taught him better than almost anyone he had ever met. They formed a group that met regularly to discuss how educated people could help improve society. He had learned to write persuasively, to lead groups of people, and to investigate complex social problems. Most importantly, he had found in Eleanor Roosevelt a partner who shared his desire to serve others and make the world a better place. Franklin quickly became a leader in this group because of his ability to listen to different opinions and find ways for everyone to work together. Teachers noticed that Franklin never tried to take all the credit for successful projects, but always made sure to praise the other students who had helped. Franklin carried a small suitcase in one hand and his father's advice in his heart. Eleanor was his fifth cousin and the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. She was shy and serious, quite different from the popular girls that most Harvard students tried to date. But Franklin was drawn to Eleanor's intelligence and her deep concern for people who were suffering. James Roosevelt had told him that these next 4 years would test his character more than anything he had experienced at Hyde Park. While other boys had formed friendships during their first years together, Franklin was the outsider trying to fit in. Harvard was the most famous college in America, and Franklin was excited to continue his education there. But Harvard was also much larger and more complicated than there were hundreds of students from all over the country and the world. Franklin would need to find his place in this new environment. She told Franklin stories about children who did not have enough food to eat and mothers who could not afford medicine when their babies got sick. These conversations opened Franklin's eyes to suffering that existed just a few miles from his comfortable world at Harvard. Some students made fun of his proper way of speaking and his enthusiasm for helping others. He said that Franklin had learned the most important lesson of all, that true leadership meant serving others rather than serving yourself. The shy boy who had arrived at Groton 4 years earlier was now a confident young man ready for the next challenge. They called him names and excluded him from their games. For the first time in his life, Franklin felt truly alone. Groton School was not like the comfortable world Franklin had always known. The hardest part for Franklin was that he was starting 2 years later than most of his classmates. But Headmaster Peabody saw something special in the young Roosevelt. Every Sunday, Peabody would give sermons in the school chapel about Christian duty and service to others. He told the boys that they were being educated not to become richer, but to become leaders who would help their communities and their country. Franklin listened carefully to these words and wrote long letters to his parents about what he was learning. He began to understand that his comfortable childhood had been preparing him for a life of service. Despite the loneliness he sometimes felt, Franklin worked hard to prove himself at Groton. These charity projects became Franklin's way of making friends at Groton. During his final year at Groton, Franklin received news that would change his life forever. When Franklin graduated from Groton in 1900, Headmaster Peabody wrote a letter to his parents praising their son's character. That challenge came in the form of Harvard University and Cambridge. At Harvard, Franklin decided to try something he had never done before. Writing for the Harvard Crimson taught Franklin valuable skills that would serve him well in his future career. During his time at Harvard, Franklin began to notice the terrible conditions that poor people faced in nearby Boston. These articles caught the attention of other students who shared Franklin's concerns about social problems. But the most important thing that happened to Franklin during his Harvard years was meeting Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor had been working with poor families in New York City, visiting their homes and trying to help them solve their problems. The more time Franklin spent with Eleanor, the more he admired her dedication to helping others. By the time Franklin graduated from Harvard in 1900, he had become a very different person than the lonely boy who had struggled to fit in at Groton. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn at Hyde Park as Franklin Roosevelt paced nervously back and forth. Today was March 17, 1905, and in just a few hours he would marry Eleanor Roosevelt in New York City. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his formal morning coat. When President Roosevelt arrived, the crowd of guests and reporters grew so large that Franklin and Eleanor almost became secondary figures at their own wedding. Theodore Roosevelt's booming voice and larger-than-life personality filled every room he entered. Franklin watched his famous cousin carefully, studying how he commanded attention and made people feel important just by talking to them. This was not just any wedding day. President Theodore Roosevelt himself would be walking Eleanor down the aisle since her father had died years earlier. President Roosevelt had shown him what real political power looked like. The way people listened when Theodore spoke, the respect they showed him, and the ability he had to inspire others to action made a deep impression on Franklin. Could someone like him, with his education and family connections, make a real difference in their lives? The more he thought about these problems, the more convinced he became that politics might be the way to create real change. For the first time, he began to seriously consider a career in politics. The Democratic Party leaders in Dutchess County needed a candidate to run for the New York State Senate. The problem was that this district had always voted for Republican candidate. She thought politics was dirty business that would ruin the family's good reputation. Even some of his friends at the law firm warned him that getting involved in politics would hurt his legal career. He listened carefully as farmers complained about unfair railroad rates. That made it expensive to ship their crops to market. He heard about banks that charged high interest rates for loans that farmers needed to plant their fields. He talked about the need for laws that would protect workers from dangerous conditions in factories. He supported giving women the right to vote. Most importantly, he convinced voters that he genuinely cared about their problems and would work hard to solve them. Farmers would stop their work in the fields to wave at him. By Election Day in November 9, Franklin had personally met thousands of voters and earned their trust and respect. He learned about corrupt politicians who took bribes from big companies and ignored the needs of ordinary people. But Eleanor supported his decision completely. She understood his desire to serve others and believed he had the skills to be an effective leader. Most experienced politicians thought it was impossible for a Democrat to win there, but Franklin saw this as the perfect chance to prove himself. The wedding ceremony took place at the home of Eleanor's cousin on East 76th Street. He had won the election by more than 1,000 votes. More importantly, he had established himself as someone who could not be bought or intimidated. Newspapers began calling him a leader of the reform movement and speculating about his future in politics. He learned that sometimes you had to be willing to make enemies in order to do what was right. He discovered that ordinary citizens would support politicians who stood up to corruption, even when it was risky. Most importantly, he realized that his comfortable background and family name gave him the independence to fight battles that other politicians could not afford to fight. At age 28, he was heading to Albany as the youngest member of the New York State Senate. The victory made headlines in newspapers across the state. He sponsored laws to help farmers get fair treatment from railroads. He supported workplace safety regulations to protect factory workers. He advocated for conservation programs to protect New York's forests and rivers. With each success, Franklin became more confident in his ability to create positive change through political action. Political experts began talking about this young Roosevelt as someone to watch for the future. His willingness to fight corruption, his genuine concern for ordinary people. and his talent for bringing different groups together had caught the attention of National Democratic Party leaders. The stage was set for even greater opportunities in the years ahead. After the ceremony, as Franklin and Eleanor began their honeymoon trip to Europe, Franklin could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed. The powerful Democratic Party boss in New York City, Charles Murphy, wanted to choose a man named William Sheehan to represent New York in the United States Senate, but many people believed Sheehan was corrupt and would not serve the people's interests. Franklin decided to oppose Murphy's choice, even though this meant fighting against the leaders of his own political party. Most politicians of that era gave speeches from platforms in town squares and relied on local party leaders to spread their message. They held secret meetings and made public speeches explaining why they could not support a candidate who represented the old corrupt system. For weeks, the battle raged in newspapers and political circles across New York. Franklin received angry letters and threats from Murphy's supporters, but he refused to back down. But Franklin decided to take his campaign directly to the people. He bought a bright red Maxwell automobile and drove from farm to farm talking to voters in their own homes. When Franklin and Eleanor returned from their honeymoon, they settled into a comfortable life in New York City. Franklin had started working at a law firm, but his heart was not really in the legal profession. He found the daily routine of writing contracts and handling business disputes boring and meaningless. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her work helping poor families in the city's worst neighborhoods. She would come home with stories about children living in dark, crowded apartments and families struggling to afford basic necessities. These stories troubled Franklin deeply. He had always known that poor people existed, but Eleanor's first-hand accounts made their suffering real to him in a way it had never been before. He began accompanying Eleanor on some of her visits to the slums. What he saw shocked him. Families of 8 or 10 people living in tiny rooms without windows. Children as young as 6 years old, working in dangerous factories. Mothers too weak from hunger to properly care for their babies. Franklin started asking himself difficult questions. Why did some people have so much while others had so little? What was the government doing to help these families? In 1910, opportunity came knocking in an unexpected way. Many people told Franklin he was making a mistake. His mother, Sarah, was especially upset. Franklin's campaign for state senate was unlike anything the rural counties had ever seen. This personal approach was revolutionary for its time. Franklin would pull up to a farmhouse, introduce himself to the family, and ask about their problems. Franklin's message was simple but powerful. He promised to fight for honest government that would serve regular working people instead of just the wealthy and powerful. The red Maxwell became famous throughout the district. Children would run alongside the car when Franklin drove through their towns. When the votes were counted, Franklin had achieved what everyone thought was impossible. Franklin's first major test as a state senator came just weeks after he took office. Franklin organized a group of reform-minded Democrats who refused to vote for Sheehan. Eventually, Murphy was forced to choose a different candidate, who was more acceptable to the reformers. Franklin had won his first major political victory. The fight against Boss Murphy taught Franklin valuable lessons about political leadership. As Franklin's first term in the state senate progressed, his reputation continued to grow. By 1912, Franklin Roosevelt had transformed himself from a bored young lawyer into one of the most promising political leaders in New York State. The summer of 1921 at Campobello Island began like any other vacation for the Roosevelt family. Franklin had just finished a tiring political campaign helping James Cox run for president, and he was looking forward to relaxing with Eleanor and their 5 children. The familiar sights and sounds of the island filled him with peace. The crash of waves against the rocky shore, the cry of seagulls overhead, and the fresh smell of salt air made all his political worries seem far away. At 39 years old, Franklin was at the peak of his physical strength. He loved to swim in the cold Atlantic waters and sail his boat around the bay. Every morning he would take long runs along the beach, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly across the sand. A forest fire had started and was threatening to spread. Without hesitation, he gathered his older children and several neighbors to help fight the blaze. Franklin was exhausted and covered with soot and sweat, but he felt good about what they had accomplished together. Franklin had to stop several times to rest, which was very unusual for him. Eleanor noticed that he looked pale and was moving more slowly than normal. Eleanor helped him upstairs to bed, thinking he might be coming down with a cold or flu. But during the night, Franklin's condition got much worse. He woke up with terrible pain in his back and legs. When he tried to get out of bed, his legs would not support his weight. When they reached the house, Franklin collapsed into a chair on the porch. He told Eleanor he felt more tired than he had ever felt in his entire life. On the way home, he suggested they all go for a swim to cool off and wash away the dirt from firefighting. The group ran down to a small lagoon where the water was warmer than the open ocean. The paralysis that had started in his legs began moving up his body. Soon, he could not move his arms either. Sarah believed that Franklin's political career was over and that he should return to Hyde Park to live quietly as an inmate. She started making plans to convert the family home to accommodate a wheelchair and to hire permanent attendants to care for her son. Even more frightening, Franklin found it difficult to control his bowel and bladder. Eleanor had to help him with the most basic needs, something that embarrassed Franklin terribly. They could see something in Franklin's eyes that Sarah had missed. Despite his physical helplessness, Franklin's spirit was not broken. He still asked questions about political developments and wanted to know what was happening in the world beyond his sick. They had to carry him on a stretcher from the cottage to a boat, then from the boat to a train. Newspaper reporters had learned about his illness and were waiting at every stop to take pictures and ask questions. Franklin was mortified by this attention. He had always been proud of his physical strength, and now the whole world could see that he was helpless. She knew that Franklin had always defined himself by his physical abilities and his active lifestyle. Now he had to find a new way to think about himself and his place in the world. She encouraged him to focus on what he could still do, rather than what he had lost. He visited regularly and brought news about political developments. Howe argued that Franklin Estes' ability might actually make him a more effective leader, because it would give him a deeper understanding of what it meant to face seemingly impossible challenges. Sometimes he would rage against the unfairness of what had happened to him. He learned to transfer himself from his bed to a wheelchair, using only his upper body strength. Most importantly, he began to think about how his experience with disability might actually help him understand and help other people who were suffering. Why should a disease strike him down just when his political career was beginning to flourish? Other times he sank into deep sadness, wondering if his life still had any purpose or meaning. Eleanor and Hal believed that Franklin could still have a meaningful career if he could find a way to overcome his disability. Someone who understood suffering and struggle in a way he never had before. Someone who would not be defeated by obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. He had survived the initial crisis and was learning to adapt to his new limitations. The man who had always solved problems through physical action would now have to find different ways to achieve his goals. But the experience of fighting through his darkest hours was teaching him lessons about courage and determination that would serve him well in the challenges that lay ahead. The doctors confirmed that he would probably never walk again. They explained that polio had destroyed the nerves that controlled his leg muscles. Even with the best medical care, his legs would remain paralyzed for the rest of his life. Franklin would have to learn to live in a completely different way. Franklin dove in eagerly, enjoying the refreshing feeling of the cool water on his overheated skin. For hours, they worked under the hot sun, cutting down trees and beating back flames with wet branches. Eleanor was frightened and called for the local doctor to come immediately. Dr. Bennett examined Franklin carefully, but could not figure out what was wrong. He had never seen anything like this before. The doctor suggested they call for a specialist from the mainland who might know more about Franklin's mysterious illness. He was one of the best doctors in New England, and Eleanor prayed he would know how to help Franklin. After a thorough examination, Dr. Lovett delivered the devastating news. Franklin, who had always been so active and strong, was now completely helpless. He could not feed himself, dress himself, or even turn over in bed without assistance. Eleanor had 2 hired nurses to help care for him around the clock. The children were confused and frightened to see their father, who had always seemed so powerful, lying helpless in bed. Franklin had contracted polio, a disease that attacked the nervous system and often left its victims permanently paralyzed. At that time, there was no cure and no effective treatment. Franklin led the effort, directing where people should work and encouraging everyone to keep going when they got tired. In the afternoons, he would organize sailing races for his children and their friends. Franklin seemed to have endless energy for swimming, hiking, and playing games with anyone who wanted to join him. On August 10, 1921, Franklin noticed smoke rising from a small island across the bay. By late afternoon, they had successfully contained the fire. But something felt different when Franklin climbed out of the lagoon. His legs seemed unusually heavy and tired. He thought this was just normal fatigue from the long day of hard work. So he suggested they walk across the island to take a quick swim in the colder ocean water. The walk that usually took 15 minutes seemed to take forever. With each step, Franklin's legs felt weaker and more unsteady. After their ocean swim, the family walked back to their cottage. That evening, Franklin could barely eat his dinner. His whole body ached, and he felt feverish. By morning, Franklin could not move his legs at all. While they waited for the specialist to arrive, Franklin's condition continued to get worse. Dr. Robert Lovett finally arrived from Boston 3 days later. The diagnosis hit the Roosevelt family like a thunderbolt. Franklin's mother, Sarah, was devastated by the news. She immediately traveled to Campobello and took charge of the situation. But Eleanor and Franklin's political advisor, Lewis Howe, had very different ideas. The journey back to New York was a nightmare for Franklin. The slightest movement caused him terrible pain. At the hospital in New York, Franklin faced the brutal reality of his situation. The next few months were the darkest period of Franklin's life. He went through stages of anger, depression, and despair. Eleanor watched her husband struggle with these emotions and felt helpless to ease his pain. Slowly, Franklin began to accept his new reality. He started doing exercises to strengthen his arms and shoulders. Lewis Howe never stopped believing that Franklin could return to politics. As 1921 came to an end, Franklin was beginning to see glimmers of hope in his situation. Franklin Roosevelt, the athlete and outdoorsman, was gone forever. But from the ashes of that old life, a new kind of leader was being born. The hot Georgia sun beat down on Franklin Roosevelt as he slowly lowered himself into the warm mineral waters of Warm Springs. It was October 1924, more than 3 years since polio had taken away his ability to walk. Franklin had heard rumors about these special waters that might help people with paralyzed limbs. It was naturally heated by underground springs and rich with minerals that some people believed had healing powers. As Franklin began to move his arms and try to float, something amazing happened. For the first time since his illness, he could feel his leg muscles responding slightly to his commands. The buoyancy of the water supported his weight and allowed him to move in ways that were impossible on dry land. Most doctors told him not to get his hopes up, but Franklin was desperate to try anything that might give him back some strength in his legs. They were amazed that someone from such a wealthy and famous family would spend so much time encouraging ordinary people like themselves. Franklin never talked down to them or made them feel like objects of charity. He used a large portion of his personal wealth to purchase the old hotel and surrounding land. His plan was to turn Warm Springs into a treatment center where polio victims from all over the country could come for therapy and rehabilitation. Many people thought Franklin was crazy to spend so much money on what seemed like a hopeless cause, but he believed deeply in the project. Instead, he treated them as equals who were fighting the same battle he was fighting. This experience taught Franklin valuable lessons about how to connect with people who were struggling and give them hope for the future. He made his way slowly to the podium with the help of his son James, who walked beside him pretending to have a casual conversation. To the crowd of thousands watching in Madison Square Garden, Franklin appeared to be walking normally. When he reached the microphone and began to speak, his voice rang out strong and clear across the arena. The water felt different from any swimming pool or ocean Franklin had ever experienced. Party leaders who had written him off as finished began to take him seriously again. People across the country who had followed his struggle with polio were inspired by his courage and determination. Franklin had successfully completed the first step in his political comeback. His passionate words about the need for honest leadership and social justice reminded everyone why they had admired him before his illness. She had become an accomplished public speaker and was able to reach audiences that male politicians often ignored, especially women voters who had only recently gained the right to vote. Eleanor S., work with social welfare organizations, gave her credibility when she spoke about Franklin's commitment to helping ordinary families. He won the race for governor by a narrow margin, proving that his political career was far from over. At age 4, the man who had been written off as a hopeless invalid was now the chief executive of the most important state in America. Franklin was reluctant to leave Warm Springs just when his treatment center was beginning to help more patients. The stock market was becoming increasingly unstable, and many working families were struggling to make ends meet. As governor, Franklin would have the opportunity to develop and test new ideas about how government could help people during difficult times. He also worried that he was not yet strong enough physically to handle the demanding schedule of a political campaign. But Smith and other party leaders convinced him that the Democratic Party needed his name recognition and popularity to have any chance of winning in New York. The lessons he had learned about courage, determination, and hope during his struggle with polio had prepared him for the leadership role that America would soon desperately need. The applause was thunderous and lasted for several minutes. Newspaper reporters wrote that Franklin Roosevelt had made one of the greatest political speeches they had ever heard. Franklin spent hours each day exercising in the Warm Springs pools. Lewis Howe continued to serve as Franklin's closest advisor and made sure that important political leaders did not forget about him. Instead of trying to hide his disability, Franklin found creative ways to turn it into an advantage. He used his specially equipped car to travel to small towns that other politicians rarely visited. When he spoke to crowds from the back of his automobile, people were impressed by his determination to reach them despite his physical limitations. His message of hope and perseverance resonated with voters who were facing their own economic struggles during the difficult years of the late 1920s. Eleanor traveled around New York, giving speeches on behalf of causes that Franklin supported. They were determined to prove that Franklin's disability did not mean his political career was over. He developed his own routine of movements that gradually strengthened his upper body and gave him better control over his paralysis. He learned to lock his leg braces in place so that he could appear to be standing normally. Even though his legs could not actually support his weight, he rehearsed his speech over and over until he could deliver it with confidence and passion. Most importantly, he developed techniques to hide his disability from the audience, so they would focus on his words rather than his physical limitations. More importantly, he met other polio victims who had come to the Springs seeking the same kind of hope he was looking for. Franklin's friend Al Smith was running for the nomination and wanted Franklin to give a speech introducing him to the convention. This would be Franklin's first major public appearance since becoming paralyzed. Many people wondered if he would be able to handle the physical and emotional pressure of speaking to thousands of people who would be watching for any sign of weakness. there was a young woman named Helen who had lost the use of both arms and legs. A teenage boy named Tom struggled to walk with heavy metal braces on his legs. An older man named George had been told by doctors that he would never work again. At first, these people were strangers, united only by their shared disability. But Franklin's natural leadership abilities soon brought them together as a community. He organized swimming races and water games that everyone could participate in regardless of their level of paralysis. He started group discussions where people could talk about their fears and frustrations without feeling ashamed. Most importantly, Franklin helped each person set realistic goals for improvement and celebrated every small victory they achieved. The other patients began to look up to Franklin as their unofficial leader. Franklin became so passionate about the healing potential of Warm Springs that he decided to buy the entire resort property. While Franklin was rebuilding his physical strength at Warm Springs, his political allies were working to keep his name alive in Democratic Party circles. The big test came in 1924, when the Democratic Party was choosing its candidate for president. Franklin spent weeks preparing for this crucial moment. He practiced standing upright while gripping a podium for support. When the night of the speech arrived, Franklin was nervous but determined. Franklin's speech, introducing Al Smith as the Happy Warrior, was a triumph that electrified the convention. More importantly for Franklin's future, the speech proved that he could still be an effective political leader despite his disability. In 1928, Al Smith finally won the Democratic nomination for president and asked Franklin to run for governor of New York. Franklin's campaign for governor was unlike any political race the state had ever seen. Franklin also benefited from Eleanor's tireless campaigning on his behalf. On Election Day in November 1928, Franklin achieved what many people had thought was impossible. Franklin's victory was especially meaningful because it came at a time when the country was beginning to face serious economic problems. The comeback kid from Warm Springs was ready to take on his biggest challenge yet. The clock tower in Albany struck midnight as Franklin Roosevelt worked late in the governor's office on October 24, 1929. Outside his window, the streets were unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. Franklin was reviewing reports about unemployment in New York when his secretary rushed in with urgent news from New York City. The stock market had crashed in a single day of panic selling. Millions of dollars in wealth had disappeared as stock prices fell like stones dropped from a cliff. They believed the best thing government could do was wait for business conditions to improve naturally. But Franklin had learned important lessons from his own struggle with disability. When crisis struck, you could not just hope for the best. You had to take action, try new approaches, and never give up fighting. Franklin immediately understood that this was not just a bad day on Wall Street, this was the beginning of something much worse. He created the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration to provide direct help to unemployed families. As the economic depression deepened in 1930 and 1931, more and more people began to think that Franklin Roosevelt might have better ideas about solving the crisis than President Hoover did. Franklin's disability, which had once seemed like a political weakness, now appeared to be a source of strength. Here was a man who understood what it meant to face seemingly impossible challenges and find ways to overcome them. This was revolutionary because most people believed that giving money to the poor would make them lazy and dependent. Franklin argued that when people were hungry and homeless through no fault of their own, government had a moral duty to help them survive. His nomination speech was delivered by radio to millions of Americans who were desperate for new leadership. Franklin promised a new deal for the American people and pledged to use all the power of the federal government to help ordinary families survive the economic crisis. Over the next few weeks, as banks began to fail and factories started closing, Franklin watched the economic disaster spread across New York like a plague. When Franklin stepped up to the microphone to deliver his first speech as president, the enormous crowd fell completely silent. His opening words would become some of the most famous in American history. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," Franklin declared in his strong, confident voice. He promised immediate action to end the banking crisis and create jobs for millions of unemployed Americans. He carried 42 of the 48 states and received nearly 23 million votes compared to Hoover's 15 million. Before the TVA, most farmers in Tennessee, Alabama, and neighboring states lived without electric lights, refrigerators, or radio. The government built a series of dams that generated cheap electricity and controlled flooding at the same time. Within a few years, the Tennessee Valley was transformed from one of the most backward regions in America to a model of modern development. He spoke to them as equals, not as subjects who needed to be lectured by their superiors. When Franco said "my friends" at the beginning of each chat, people believed that he really meant it. He shared their struggles and was working day and night to make their lives better. The American people had sent a clear message that they wanted dramatic change in how their government responded to the economic emergency. This dramatic step stopped the panic that was destroying the financial system. Unemployment was still high, and many problems remained unsolved. But Americans could see that their government was finally taking serious action. The man who had refused to give up when polio paralyzed his legs was now teaching an entire country how to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. During that week, government inspectors examined the books of every bank to determine which ones were sound enough to reopen safely. The Civilian Conservation Corps put 250,000 young men to work planting trees and building trails in national forests. The Agricultural Adjustment Act helped farmers get fair prices for their crops. The National Industrial Recovery Act set minimum wages and maximum working hours to protect factory workers from exploitation. When the banks reopened, people had confidence that their money was secure, and the banking crisis was over. Franklin traveled thousands of miles by train, speaking to huge crowds in every state. Despite his paralyzed legs, he projected an image of boundless energy and optimism. While President Hoover gave gloomy speeches about the need for patience, Franklin offered concrete plans for immediate action. Every Sunday evening, he gave radio talks that he called fireside chats. Sitting in the White House with a microphone in front of him, Franklin spoke directly to families gathered around their radios in living rooms across the country. He used simple language that everyone could understand to explain what the government was doing and why it would help solve their problems. He promised to create jobs, save family farms, and restore hope to a nation that had almost given up believing in the future. Men who had good jobs on Monday were standing in breadlines by Friday. Families who had been comfortable suddenly could not afford to pay their rent or buy food for their children. During those months, the Depression grew even worse. By Inauguration Day, 1 out of every 4 workers in America was unemployed. Banks were failing so fast that many states had declared bank holidays to prevent people from withdrawing their savings in panic. Franklin later said that he felt like a doctor arriving at the bedside of a patient who was nearly dead. Most political leaders, including President Herbert Hoover in Washington, insisted that the economic downturn would be temporary. As governor of New York, Franklin began experimenting with programs that no state had ever tried before. Franklin also started public works projects that hired unemployed men to build parks, roads, and other useful improvements. Critics called this wasteful government spending, but Franklin saw it differently. These projects served purposes. They gave jobless men a chance to earn money with dignity rather than accepting charity. At the same time, they created valuable public facilities that would benefit everyone for years to come. The success of these New York programs caught the attention of Democrats across the country. When the Democratic Party met in Chicago in July 1932 to choose their candidate for president, Franklin was the clear favorite. The election campaign of 1932 was unlike any in American history. On Election Day, Franklin won the biggest victory in presidential history up to that time. But Franklin would not take office until March 4, 1933, for long months after the election. The inaugural ceremony took place on a cold, gray morning in Washington. Franklin's first act as president was to declare a national bank holiday, closing every bank in the country for 1 week. But Franklin was just getting started. During his first 100 days in office, he pushed an amazing 15 major laws through Congress. One of Franklin's most ambitious programs was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought electricity to some of the poorest rural areas in the South. Franklin's ability to explain these complex programs to ordinary Americans was just as important as the programs themselves. These radio talks made Franklin feel like a trusted friend to millions of Americans who had never met him. The first 100 days of Franklin's presidency restored hope to a nation that had almost lost faith in itself. The autumn leaves were falling at Hyde Park when Franklin Roosevelt received the telephone call that would change everything. It was September 1, 1939, and his old friend Winston Churchill was calling from London with terrible news. German tanks and planes had crossed into Poland at dawn, beginning what would become the most devastating war in human history. As Franklin listened to Churchill's urgent voice crackling over the transatlantic telephone line, he knew that America's peaceful isolation from European conflicts was about to end. Hitler's Nazi Party preached hatred against Jewish people and other minorities. They had built a massive military machine and were clearly preparing for conquest. Franklin received secret reports from American diplomats in Europe who described the brutal treatment of anyone who opposed Hitler's government. He knew that if Hitler conquered all of Europe, America would eventually face a terrible enemy with unlimited resources. He found creative ways to bend the neutrality laws without actually breaking them. When Britain needed old American destroyers to protect their ships from German submarines, Franklin arranged a deal to trade destroyers from military bases in British colonies. No American president had ever served more than 2 terms, and many people thought Franklin was trying to become a dictator like Hitler or Stalin. But Franklin believed that changing leaders in the middle of such a dangerous time would be a mistake. He argued that experienced leadership was essential. When America faced threats from enemies who had been preparing for war for years, he called this helping America's own defense. But everyone knew the real purpose was to keep Britain fighting. His Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, accused him of secretly planning to drag America into war. Franklin had to convince voters that he was working for peace, while also preparing the country for the possibility of conflict. He promised American mothers that their sons would not be sent to fight in foreign wars unless America itself was attacked. For most Americans in 1939, the war in Europe seemed like someone else's problem. Since Congress would not let him sell weapons to Britain, Franklin proposed the Lend-Lease program. Under this plan, America would lend military equipment to any country whose defense was vital to American security. Britain could borrow American planes, tanks, and ships, and pay for them after the war was over. Franklin compared this to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. He met secretly with Winston Churchill in August 1941 aboard ships anchored in a bay off Newfoundland. The two leaders, who had been corresponding for years, finally had a chance to discuss their shared vision for the post-war world. Churchill was short and round with a cigar always in his mouth, while Franklin was tall and dignified despite his hidden disability, but they shared a deep understanding of the threats facing democratic civilization and a determination to defeat them. Their friendship would become one of the most important partnerships in world history. They signed the Atlantic Charter, which outlined principles of democracy and human rights that would guide the Allied cause throughout the war. He understood that America would soon face a choice between fighting for democracy around the world or watching it die everywhere except in the Western Hemisphere. The storm clouds that had been gathering for years were about to break with terrible fury. Franklin had authorized the Navy to shoot on sight any German vessel that threatened American shipping. Several American destroyers had been torpedoed, and dozens of American sailors had died. The country was moving steadily toward full involvement in the war, but most Americans still hoped that somehow the conflict could be avoided. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression, and people wanted their government to focus on creating jobs and helping families get back on their feet. Many Americans were still unsure about his leadership and worried about the direction he was taking the country. Some people accused him of lying about his war plans. Soon, American factories were working around the clock to produce weapons and supplies for Britain, Russia, and other countries fighting against Germany and Japan. The program transformed America into what Franklin called the arsenal of democracy, providing the tools that democratic nations needed to defend themselves against dictators. Speaking to the nation by radio, he explained that America's safety depended on helping other democratic countries fight against dictatorships. He argued that if Hitler conquered Europe, America would be surrounded by hostile enemies and would have to become a military fortress to survive. It was better to help other countries fight Hitler now than to wait until America had to fight him alone later. Others said he was not doing enough to help Britain and France fight against Hitler. Franklin knew that America could not remain neutral much longer, but he also knew that most Americans were not yet ready for war. He began giving speeches to prepare the public for what he believed was inevitable, American involvement in the conflict. Franklin had to find a middle path between these opposing views, while events in Europe moved faster than anyone had expected. Congress had passed laws forbidding the president from selling weapons to countries at war. Many people believed that if America stayed neutral and minded its own business, the war would never reach American shores. Many Americans remembered the terrible losses of World War I and were determined never again to send their sons to die in foreign battles. Franklin understood these feelings, but he also saw dangers that most of his fellow citizens did not yet recognize. Franklin had been watching Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany with growing alarm since the early 1930s. The challenge for Franklin was how to prepare America for war without getting too far ahead of public opinion. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with European conflicts, but Franklin began taking careful steps to help Britain and France fight against Germany. Franklin's most important decision during this period was to run for president a third time in 1940. The 1940 election campaign was one of the most difficult of Franklin's career. Franklin won the election, but the victory was much closer than his previous campaigns. The situation became much more serious in the spring of 1941, when German submarines began attacking American ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Franklin's most important speech during this period was his Arsenal of Democracy address in December 1940. The Arsenal of Democracy speech led to one of Franklin's most creative solutions to the neutrality problem. Many Americans opposed Lend-Lease as a trick to get the country into war, but Franklin convinced Congress to approve the program in March 1941. As 1941 progressed, Franklin found himself drawn deeper into military planning and strategy. Franklin and Churchill made an odd pair. By the fall of 1941, American ships were already fighting an undeclared war against German submarines in the Atlantic. Franklin knew better. In his private moments, he studied maps and intelligence reports that showed German and Japanese forces growing stronger every month. Franklin Roosevelt was having lunch at his desk in the White House on December 7, when Navy Secretary Frank Knox burst into the Oval Office with a face as white as paper. Japanese planes had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Battleships were sinking, planes were burning, and thousands of American sailors and soldiers were dead or wounded. This surprise attack that Franklin had feared for months had finally come, but it was even worse than he had imagined. Franklin immediately called for his military advisors and began making the decisions that would transform America from a peaceful nation into the greatest military power in world history. His first priority was to find out exactly what had happened at Pearl Harbor and how badly the Pacific Fleet had been damaged. The news was devastating. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged. Nearly 200 planes had been destroyed on the ground. More than 2,400 Americans had been killed in just 2 hours of fighting. They argued that America should focus all its strength on either Europe or the Pacific, not both. But Franklin understood that Germany and Japan were working together and had to be defeated together. He developed a strategy called Europe First. That made defeating Hitler the main priority, while still fighting hard enough in the Pacific to prevent Japan from becoming too strong. He created new government agencies to coordinate the supply of raw materials like steel and rubber. He also dealt with labor unions to prevent strikes that would slow down war production. The goal was to produce so many weapons and supplies that American forces would always have more equipment than their enemies. Factories that had been making cars and refrigerators quickly converted to producing tanks, planes, and ships. The Ford Motor Company built a huge new plant that could produce one B-24 bomber every hour. Franklin knew that Russia was essential to defeating Germany, because Soviet armies were fighting millions of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. But Franklin also understood that Stalin was a brutal dictator who had killed millions of his own people. The conference was historic because it was the first time the leaders of America, Britain, and Russia had met together. Franklin spent hours talking privately with Stalin, trying to understand what the Soviet leader wanted after the war. In 1939, Albert Einstein had written a letter warning that Germany might be working on a nuclear weapon. Franklin authorized the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program to build an American atomic bomb, before the Germans could complete theirs. The project eventually employed more than 100,000 people and cost $2 billion, but it was so secret that even most members of Congress did not know it existed. He came away believing that Stalin could be trusted to cooperate in building a peaceful post-war world, a judgment that many people later criticized as too optimistic. Franklin believed he could work with Stalin during the war and then find ways to limit Soviet power when the fighting ended. He spent countless hours working on plans for the UN and trying to convince other world leaders to support the idea. Franklin believed that if the great powers could continue working together after the war, they could solve international problems peaceably instead of fighting about them. General Motors factories turned out machine guns and aircraft engines. German armies were retreating on all fronts, and Japan was under constant attack from American bombers. Franklin began focusing more attention on post-war planning and less on day-to-day military operations. He was determined to create a world where future generations would not have to endure the terrible suffering World War II had brought to millions of innocent people. He was leading a global war effort while also managing domestic politics and planning for the post-war world. His doctors were concerned about his high blood pressure and heart problems, but Franklin refused to slow down. Franklin's leadership during World War II established America as a global superpower and helped preserve democratic values in a world threatened by totalitarian dictatorships. He believed that America needed experienced leadership to win the war and create a lasting peace. The two men met in person 9 times during the war and exchanged hundreds of letters and telephone calls. They did not always agree on strategy, but they trusted each other completely and worked together to coordinate British and American military operations. Even small companies found ways to contribute to the war effort by making parts for weapons and equipment. 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II, including Franklin's own 4 sons who all enlisted to fight. He worried that nuclear weapons would make future wars so destructive that human civilization might not survive them. He hoped that the bomb would end World War II quickly and save millions of lives that would be lost in a prolonged conflict. But he also began thinking about how to control these weapons after the war ended. Women took jobs in factories and shipyards that had previously been reserved for men. African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities to work in defense plants. The entire country was united in a common effort to win the war as quickly as possible. The next morning, Franklin appeared before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan. His speech was short but powerful. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Within an hour, Congress had voted almost unanimously to declare war. The long debate about American neutrality was over. Franklin was now a wartime president, leading his country in the greatest conflict in human history. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing America into the European conflict as well. Franklin now faced enemies on 2 sides of the world. In the Pacific, Japanese forces were conquering territory from the Philippines to Southeast Asia. In Europe, German armies controlled most of the continent and were threatening to invade Britain. Franklin had to coordinate the largest military mobilization in American history, while maintaining alliances with countries that did not always agree with each other. Franklin's first challenge was to convince the American people that they could fight and win a war on 2 fronts. Many military experts believed this was impossible. The industrial transformation that Franklin oversaw during the war was simply amazing. Franklin worked closely with business leaders to make sure that factories had everything they needed to increase production. The human mobilization was just as impressive as the industrial effort. Franklin's most important job as commander-in-chief was managing relationships with other Allied leaders. Winston Churchill became his closest partner and friend. The most difficult relationship was with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Franklin's first face-to-face meeting with Stalin took place in Tehran, Iran, in November 1943. One of the most difficult decisions Franklin had to make during the war concerned the development of the atomic bomb. Franklin never lived to see the atomic bomb used in combat, but he understood its terrible implications. As the war progressed, Franklin's health began to decline under the enormous pressure of his responsibilities. Franklin's vision for the post-war world centered on the United Nations, an international organization that would prevent future wars through cooperation and collective security. By early 1945, it was clear that the Allies were winning the war. The man who had overcome personal paralysis to lead America through its greatest economic crisis was now guiding the nation through its largest and most successful military effort. The warm Georgia sun streamed through the windows of the little white house at Warm Springs on April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt sat quietly in his favorite chair, wearing a dark blue cape and red tie, as artist Elizabeth Shumatoff painted his portrait. After more than 12 years as president, Franklin looked tired and much older than his 63 years. This organization had been his dream for years, a place where all the nations of the world could work together to prevent future wars. He was looking forward to seeing his vision become reality. But first, he needed to recover from the exhausting Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin just 2 months earlier. He seemed peaceful and content, surrounded by the place that had given him so much hope during his darkest days with polio. The mineral springs that had helped him learn to fight again were still bubbling up from deep in the earth, just as they had 20 years earlier when he first discovered their healing power. The enormous strain of leading America through the Great Depression and World War II had taken a terrible toll on his health. Truman would have to decide whether to use the atomic bomb that Franklin had authorized but never seen completed. He would have to deal with Stalin and other world leaders who had trusted Franklin but were suspicious of the new American president. Franklin had come to Warm Springs to rest and regain his strength. Before traveling to San Francisco for the opening of the United Nations Conference, African-American soldiers stood at attention as the train passed through the South. Factory workers who had built the weapons that won the war took off their hats in silence. Eleanor stood quietly beside the grave as a military honor guard fired their rifles in salute. The man who had been born into wealth and privilege on this same estate years earlier had returned home after a lifetime of service to his country and the world. 3 months later, after President Truman decided to use the atomic bombs that Franklin had helped create, Japan also surrendered, and World War II was finally over. He fundamentally changed how Americans think about their government and what it should do for them. Before Franklin, most people believed that government should stay out of economic affairs and let businesses operate without regulation. Franklin proved that government could be a force for good in people's lives, helping them when they faced problems too big to solve alone. The United Nations that Franklin had dreamed about became a reality. When representatives from 50 countries signed its charter in San Francisco, his vision of international cooperation was beginning to take shape, even though he was not there to see it. During the 1930s, many people believed that only dictatorships like those in Germany and Russia could make quick decisions and take bold action. Franklin proved that democratic leaders could move just as fast and be just as decisive as dictators, while still respecting individual freedom and human rights. When polio paralyzed his legs, many people expected him to retire from public life and live quietly as a wealthy invalid. Instead, Franklin used his struggle with disability to develop the strength and compassion he needed to help an entire nation overcome its own paralysis during the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's life proved that one person, no matter what obstacles they face, can make a difference that lasts for generations. His story continues to inspire leaders around the world who are fighting for democracy, human rights, and social justice. They remind us that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the deepest struggles, and that hope can spring eternal, even in the darkest times. Washington established the office of the presidency and proved that democratic leadership could work. Lincoln preserved the Union and ended slavery. Franklin saved democracy from economic collapse and military defeat, while expanding the meaning of freedom to include economic security and social justice. Farmers whose land had been saved by New Deal programs brought their children to wave goodbye to the president who had helped their families survive. As the artist worked on her painting, Franklin reviewed papers and signed letters at a small table beside his chair. The Social Security system that provides retirement income for elderly Americans was his creation. His famous words that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself reminded people that most problems could be solved if they refused to give up hope. His fireside chats brought the presidency into ordinary family living rooms and made people feel like their government cared about their daily struggles. Unemployment insurance that helps people who lose their jobs exists because Franklin believed government should protect citizens from economic hardship. Federal deposit insurance that guarantees bank savings was part of his plan to prevent another Great Depression. In America, people gathered on street corners and in their homes, many of them crying openly for a president who had been like a father figure to them during the most difficult times in their lives. Men and women who had found jobs through his New Deal programs felt like they had lost a personal friend. Soldiers fighting in Europe and the Pacific wondered if they could still win the war without the leader who had inspired them to fight for freedom and democracy. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Franklin suddenly pressed his hand to his forehead and said quietly, "I have a terrific headache." Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from one of the greatest leaders in American history. Franklin slumped forward in his chair, unconscious from a massive stroke that had burst blood vessels in his brain. Within 2 hours, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. The news of Franklin's death shocked the entire world. Vice President Harry Truman, who had barely spoken to Franklin during their few months serving together, suddenly found himself responsible for finishing the war and building the peace. The funeral train that carried Franklin's body from Georgia to Washington and then to Hyde Park was met by millions of Americans who lined the railroad tracks to pay their final respects. Franklin was buried in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park on a beautiful spring morning, just as the trees were beginning to bloom with new life. Within weeks of Franklin's death, the war in Europe ended with Germany's surrender. Franklin's impact on America was so profound that it is still felt today, more than 80 years after he first became president. But Franklin's legacy goes far beyond any specific program or law. Franklin also showed the world that democracy could be strong and effective in times of crisis. Perhaps most importantly, Franklin demonstrated that personal courage and determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Franklin's optimism and confidence inspired millions of Americans to believe in themselves and their country's future. Today, Franklin Roosevelt is remembered alongside George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as one of the 3 greatest presidents in American history. The boy who had organized his neighbors to help local farmers during harvest season had grown up to organize an entire nation to help save the world from tyranny and oppression. The mineral springs at Warm Springs still bubble up from deep in the Georgia earth, just as they did when Franklin first discovered their healing power.